As a child, I always knew that I was different from the rest of my family. My name is Betty, and I come from that long, restless line of restaurant owners whose names adorned menus and signs in gold letters. We were a family where everyone knew their role, where there was no place for chance and worry about the future. Everything was planned, predictable, like a good kitchen, where every dish should be prepared exactly according to the recipe. My father, the owner of a chain of restaurants, was always busy with business, managing staff, making deals, organizing events. He was not just a businessman, but a true master of his craft, with his morning meetings, evening dinners, loud conversations about profitability and cost reduction. And this world was my world, with the smells of spices, fried meat, and aromas that permeate street restaurants. Everything was done with love, and I felt like an alien in this world. Everything in my family was built on solid foundations, from reliable habits to strict expectations. Older brother Mike was what was called the golden boy. He was the direct heir to his father's business, a man who was ready to take over the management of the business. I always saw him as a leader, confident in himself and his abilities, someone who knew how to act in any situation. We weren't particularly close, but I understood that his successes were as inevitable as the sunrise. And so one evening I was sitting at the dining table again in the huge dining room of our house. The rich smell of Dad's famous roast meat was in the air, and there was a calm atmosphere amid the noise and conversations of the family. Mom, as always, was in the middle of the action, discussing a new recipe that she and Dad had just tried. I remember how her eyes sparkled with enthusiasm when she turned to me with a smile. "Betty, you'll like it. There's this fancy herb in this dish, whatever it's called. You like that kind of thing, don't you?" I slowed down my movements, thinking. I couldn't remember the name of this herb, but I saw a glimpse of it, the juicy greens that Dad always experimented with on the grill. I mumbled something unintelligible, picking at the food on my plate with a fork, barely trying to concentrate. Mike laughed from the other end of the table, ignoring the fact that I wasn't laughing. "Who cares about this stupid grass?" he said, stuffing his mouth with meat. "Wait until you see how the new chefs on the grill work. That's the real deal." His laughter echoed in the room, and Dad, despite his fatigue, looked at me with concern. "Betty, when will you start to be interested in this? You're not getting any younger, you know. These restaurants are your future, don't forget that." His words were full of sincere concern, but also of an underlying pressure. He didn't ask, he claimed. There was something of urgency in his voice, something that made me feel invisible amid all this talk about business, money, and success. I tried to squeeze myself into the chair, feeling how the boundaries of this world were squeezing me, how cramped and uncomfortable it was here. "I do not know, Dad," I whispered. My words were more a whisper than an answer. I didn't have the courage to express what I really felt. I wasn't like them. I didn't want to be a part of this world where every morning started with a discussion of new recipes and chefs. I didn't understand why everyone around me thought it was so important. How can you live and breathe this world if you don't feel passion for what is happening? Dad just nodded, but his gaze was steady, penetrating like light through a fog. "You'll understand someday," he said. "You'll understand how important this is, Betty. Understanding does not come immediately. You need more time." I wanted to object, but I couldn't find the right words. At that moment, I felt a surge of helplessness. Dad was right, I wasn't getting any younger. As time went on, I felt more and more that I was standing apart from all this family business, like an inappropriate spot against the background of a perfectly constructed picture. Grandma Rose wiped her forehead and looked at me with her wise old eyes, which reflected a life full of observations and quiet revelations. She was always the kind of person you could talk to without words. Grandma knew that I didn't fit into the world of our family. And no matter how hard my parents tried to steer me in the right direction, they didn't see what she saw. "Your parents just want the best for you, Betty," she said, her voice full of quiet confidence. as always when she talked about important things. But they don't see the world the same way we do. These words sounded like something more than just consolation. It was a look at things from a different angle, which I tried to understand, but could not always. These plants on Earth have magic, Grandma continued, pointing to the garden that was her kingdom. There, in the midst of the misty dawn, I felt like every grass, every leaf was breathing something more than just life. They were part of something eternal, like the earth itself, which accepts and preserves everything. It's okay to be different. Those words covered me like a soft blanket on a cold night. I clung to them, despite the fact that the pressure from my family was becoming more and more palpable. Everyone expected the same from me as from others. I was expected to have ambitions, to participate in business, in a restaurant. And all I wanted was to stay here, among the plants, among the earth, where every breath feels real, alive. Mike used to make fun of me a lot. He called me the gardener, and his tone was such that it sounded like a mockery, like something humiliating. "Hey, gardener, are you going to plant a salad for tonight's dinner?" He would say when I was alone, planting plants or tending the garden. His friends were laughing behind his back, and I just rolled my eyes and walked away. I knew that they did not understand what I saw in these plants, did not see the beauty in the morning dew, did not notice how each leaf opens under the first ray of sunlight. For them it was just a garden, but for me it was a world where I could be myself. There, among the plants, I felt whole, as if my hands were part of this world, and the earth embraced me, giving me a sense of peace and meaning. I felt that I was in my place, and nothing in the world could convince me otherwise. The house, meanwhile, was buzzing with excitement. Mike, as always, was the center of attention. Everyone was talking about his plans. He was going to join his father at the restaurant. It was an event that everyone was waiting for. His father was proud of him, and his mother looked forward to Mike taking his place at the negotiating table, becoming a worthy successor to the family business. Every day it became more and more obvious that Mike and the restaurant were an inseparable bond that no one could break, even if they wanted to. At this time, I stayed in the shadows. I was in my own world, quiet and secluded. In the family, I was perceived as something additional, not so important. I couldn't participate in the affairs that occupied all the thoughts of Mike and my parents. I was an observer. And although I didn't share their enthusiasm for the restaurant business, I couldn't help but respect their hard work and dedication. But despite all my efforts, I realized more and more that I did not belong in this world full of fire and ambition. My life was different, hidden, like the land I cultivated. I knew there was magic in it. Every seedling, every flower was not just a part of the garden for me, it was my thoughts, my feelings, my personal universe. And even when the whole house, including Mike, was seething with excitement about his new step into the restaurant business, I felt like a stranger in this turbulent world. I sometimes sat in my garden, watching the sun gild the leaves, and felt the whole world in this moment, a world in which there was no place for fuss, expectations, and obligations. Here, among the green stems and delicate flowers, I could be myself, without any expectations, without pressure, just Betty, with her own dreams and hopes that had nothing to do with the restaurant business. It was at these moments that I felt everything else disappear. Life as it was, with its plans and ambitions, did not matter. At that moment, in the earth, in these plants, I found my freedom and understanding that for me the real magic is to be myself, to be in a place where I can live without other people's expectations. Jo allowed the girl to follow her heart, realizing that she had a gift that should not be wasted. She told me this with such confidence, as if each of us in the world is obliged to find our vocation, and for her there was no doubt that I was on the right track. It was a comfort in that obscure world of expectations where I had to struggle all the time to be myself. I felt that my heart was pulling me in the opposite direction to what was meant for me by birth. There was something like confusion in the eyes of the parents, and also despair. They saw my path as a straight line from the family table to the restaurant, but I couldn't go there. I was like grass in the wind, not tied to the ground, but constantly looking for it. I should have been different. Your eyes are on Dad, Joe said, but Dad, as usual, only let out an irritated growl. I could feel his frustration rolling in like a tide. He was so close to taking everything into his own hands, and it would have been easier than seeing me trying to resist. I'm turning away, he said, no longer hiding his disappointment. Okay, do whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when everything falls apart. These words hung in the air like heavy, sharp stones. I felt the inner tension pour out into a dull silence, in which I stood, gulping air so as not to show how much it hurt me. When I turned to leave the room, my heart was pounding so hard that I thought it was about to burst out. Mike, as always, could not miss the opportunity to mock, and his voice, full of sarcasm, sounded like a final sentence to me. Good luck, Gardner, he said, his laughter loud and merciless. Let's see how far these flowers will help you enter student life. I felt his words stabbing into me like sharp needles, and without hesitation, I left the room so as not to show how much it hurt me. The world outside the door was still noisy, but with every step I took, I felt myself gradually breaking away from everything that was familiar to me. It was like diving into deep water, and it was both exciting and terrifying. I, Betty, was on the verge of getting away from all the familiar paths that awaited me from birth. I was ready to build my life among landscapes, among herbs and flowers that gave me comfort, that made me feel like I was finding my place in this world. I still remember the noise of the first day in class. The room was seething with the energy of impatient students who were looking for their way, their opportunities, their freedom. I found a place for myself in the very corner, at the back, trying to hide in the shadows. It was important to be in the shadows, not to attract attention, not to give reason to doubt yourself. I wanted to be small and invisible, like a plant that grows without noise, quietly and humbly. But at that moment, my life changed. That's when I saw her. Zoya. A girl with fire in her eyes, with such bright and selfless energy that she immediately attracted the attention of everyone in the audience. Her gaze was so intense that I felt his power penetrate me like a bright lightning, ready to destroy everything that had happened before. She was the person who could overshadow all my doubts and make me believe that the world around me was not the way it was painted for me. Zoya was the very engine that could awaken in me all the things that I had been hiding for a long time. She came up to me on a break, and I, surprisingly to myself, did not pull away. She asked me how I liked studying, and, smiling, added, "You're not the kind of person who prefers to hide in the shadows, are you?" These words sounded like a challenge, like a confession that I couldn't seem to accept. But suddenly I realized that I needed to hear exactly that in order to finally break the chains that held me. With Zoya, I felt like I was starting to see the world in a different way. With her, everything became possible, and it was scary, and it was wonderful. I clenched my teeth, trying to keep my voice steady so as not to let my emotions get the better of me. It was my choice, and I wasn't going to betray anyone. "Mom, I just chose a different path," I said, hoping that these words would at least explain a little why I retreated from what seemed to me the only right thing. But her laugh, which sounded bitter and somehow dry, left no room for doubt. "A dead end, you mean," she said with such cold detachment, as if the very idea that I could be different was too much for her. "Don't expect us to be here waiting for everything around you to collapse." These words were like stones falling into water. They sounded in my head, echoing in my ears and heart with pain. The call ended almost immediately after her remark. I felt a sour taste in my mouth, like an unbearably bitter medicine, but it was he who became the catalyst that ignited the fire in me. I couldn't afford to fall. Not now. I returned to work with a new intensity, feeling the determination growing inside me. It wasn't just a fight against the disappointment of my family, it was my personal challenge. I had to prove not only to them, but also to myself that this path was not a mistake. I knew that life has a tendency to throw crooked balls, and so my ball arrived in the form of a phone call. He broke the silence of my last year in college, when it seemed like I was starting to find my way, even through thorns. The call was from Aunt Clara, my mom's sister. Her voice was trembling, strained and unbearably quiet, as if she herself was trying to gather the strength to say what she couldn't help but say. "Betty, this is about your Grandma Rose. She passed away." Instantly, everything in me froze. The world, which seemed as solid and stable as a knife edge, suddenly loosened its grip, and I felt its blade begin to slide over me. My grandmother Rose, the one who always told me that it's okay to be different, who taught me to see magic in simple things, who always believed in my gift, is gone. I closed my eyes, trying to capture at least one moment of her presence, this moment that flashed so vividly in my memory, her old garden filled with the aromas of herbs and flowers, her wise words that penetrated my soul like fragments of a misty morning, filling me with a sense of belonging to something bigger than me she could have realized. And now I was standing in this moment without her. But this loss was not a void. She was fire. She ignited something intangible in me that I had to understand, that I had to live. The call ended, and I remained standing with the phone in my hand, as if with a heavy load. The news still left a hollow feeling in my chest, but I knew that Grandma wouldn't want me to mourn her. She always said, "Life is too short to dwell on what is already behind us." I clutched the phone and sighed. No one could replace Grandma Rose, but her lessons stayed with me. I couldn't afford to stop, no matter how hard it was for me. And at that moment, I realized that I needed to move on to justify her faith in me. As I entered the restaurant, I felt the sights and sounds of the past crashing down on me like a heavy cloud that seems familiar, but still alien. This world, the world of my family, swallowed me whole, despite all the time I tried to spend away from it. Everything in this place was painfully familiar: the smell of spices, the velvety darkness of muffled conversations, the flickering of candles in huge candlesticks, which reflected the hard, cold eyes of the waiters. It was all part of my past, which I seemed to be trying to leave behind. I noticed my family at the other end of the hall. Mom, Dad, and Mike. They were sitting at one of the tables, dressed up like in a picture from a glossy magazine. The perfect family, the perfect image, the perfect moment. But something about it, in their buttoned-up suits and expensive dresses, seemed fake, like inanimate objects in a showcase. I gathered all my courage and, despite the throbbing feeling of heaviness in my chest, took a step forward. When I approached them, my mother, noticing me, seemed to break through an invisible wall between us. She met my gaze, and her voice broke through the noise of the hall, sharp and cold, like a knife that casually touches the skin. "I didn't think you'd accept the invitation," she said. I felt her words sink into me, as the cells under my skin began to pulse in time with her displeasure. But I tried to stay calm. "I came to see Mike get married," I replied, trying to speak as evenly as possible than I really felt. "This is a family event, isn't it?" The words immediately found their purpose. They were like a harsh but fair reminder that I still belonged to this world, no matter how far away it seemed to me. Mike, noticing my approach, looked up and grinned. His smile was familiar and, as always, undesirable, thin, with a kind of light mockery that could not help but hurt. "What's the matter, Betty?" "What is it?" he asked, his voice full of cynical lightness. "Have you run out of bushes that need to be trimmed? Decided to play dress-up for a change?" His words were aimed precisely at the target, with his characteristic bitterness, which always brought pain, but I had already learned to ignore it. I felt something tighten in my stomach, but I brushed it off. I knew I shouldn't give up. "I'm here to wish Mike all the best," that's exactly what I said, and it was the only thing I could say so as not to show how much I was hurt by his every attack. It was at this moment that his fiancée, a tall woman with fiery eyes, intervened. She was bright, like an explosion of color that could never be passed over. "Oh, that's the infamous gardening sister," she said with a smirk that was both mocking and furious. Did you manage to get the dirt out from under your nails, dear, or is this your natural look? Her words were razor sharp, and she didn't hide her dislike. I froze for a moment, feeling her words go straight to my heart, tearing apart the thin layer of protection that I had been building for so long. But this time I didn't give her the pleasure of seeing that her insult mattered. I just stood a little higher, straightened my back and replied, no longer hiding my irritation, but without a shadow of anger, nice to meet you. I'm surprised you haven't taken the time to clean up your language yet. Her gaze became even brighter, and I felt something tense, almost tangible, in the air. But before her reaction could reach its peak, I turned and walked to the bar. I understood that at that moment I needed to be distant, as if I were part of another life, another world in which there would be no place for these people playing at malice. I ordered a drink, feeling like every second I spent here took away my strength, but at the same time gave me something more, an invincible determination. Here, amid the sounds of loud conversations and the buzzing of the hall, I felt that I belonged to this world only by deciding for myself that I would not allow myself to be destroyed by this place. Mike said, his voice was laced with a mixture of amusement and contempt, and I immediately realized that he was enjoying my discomfort. His friend laughed out loud and added, every family has its own black sheep. These words hit me like a slap in the face, sharp and painful, like a blow to the weakest point. I felt my very existence in this family bleed, and for a moment it seemed to me that the whole world had become cold and inhospitable. I couldn't understand why it hurt so much. Why did I let their words get inside me? I was determined to be different, to prove that my life makes sense, even if it doesn't fit into their ideal framework. I left, although my heart was pounding in my chest, loud as a drum, reminding myself that their opinion should not determine me. I walked past them without stopping, despite the mocking glances and invisible arrows that flew in my direction. The crowd seemed like an ocean in which I was drowning, having neither an oar nor a hope of salvation. But something inside me was forcing me to move forward, something that I couldn't and didn't want to let go. As I was making my way through the crowd, I bumped into Lucy. She was like a quiet presence in our noisy family world, like a light shadow that does not require attention, but, nevertheless, is always there. Lucy was the only person in our family who never hid her admiration for my projects. She always supported me, even when the others were laughing or shaking their heads in disbelief. Hey, Betty, I've seen some of your projects, she said, and there was no mockery or displeasure in her voice, only sincere respect. It's really something. I felt my chest grow warm from her words. I smiled slightly, not even trying to hide the gratitude that filled me. Thank you, Lucy, it means a lot, especially today, I said, as if these simple words could restore my mental balance at least a little. She knew that it was difficult for me to be here, among these people who did not see and did not want to see what I was doing, what I was. Lucy looked at me with her eyes full of understanding, and I felt her words penetrate me like a light rain on dry ground. I know, Betty, she said, I never agreed with the way they treated you. You're doing amazing things. I'm glad you didn't go astray. Her words were a small comfort to me among the thorns that everyone else was throwing at me. And at that moment, I felt all the tension that had been building up in my chest ease a little. Lucy was my support, my quiet island in this stormy sea, and despite everything that was happening around me, it was nice to know that at least one soul in this family really understood me. We chatted briefly, but for me this conversation was like a momentary respite in this eternal marathon, in which I always felt like an alien. Lucy left, and I returned to my corner, as always in search of silence, where I could gather my thoughts and take a little break from everything that was happening around. But despite this moment of respite, I couldn't forget how deeply Mike's words hurt me, how they ignited a fire in my soul that I had been trying to put out since childhood. I could still feel that fire burning, but now it wasn't just the ignition of pain, it was the light that guided me, no matter what happened. I was standing in this corner of the restaurant, and even when the speeches and laughter raged around me, I was trying to find the strength for the next step. But every next step seemed more and more difficult. The mayor nodded respectfully at me before continuing on his way, and I felt his gaze slide over me as if I were someone worthy of attention. It was more than just a formal confession. It was as if he was paying tribute to me, without unnecessary words, as a sign of respect for who I had become. I watched him walk away and felt the tension release from me, even for a moment. I returned to my seat, sat down in the shade, but with a clear feeling that my world had finally stood up for itself in a way it had never done before. I was no longer just a gardener or an outcast, as my family believed me to be. I was Betty, a recognized landscape designer, someone who found her way despite everyone who doubted it. All this was not just a victory over their distrust, but also over their own doubts. I proved to myself that I don't need to be a part of their world to be successful. I grew up beyond the narrow expectations of my family, breaking down their walls that they built around me. And I felt like I was real for the first time, like confidence, like a light that finally broke through the clouds. After it became known about my success as a landscape designer, people started talking about the awards I had won, about the projects I had carried out. I heard them discussing my achievements, and it was strange and wonderful at the same time. It seemed to me that I came out into the sunlight after many years in the shade, like a plant that finally got enough light to bloom. I felt the space around me expand, as the doors opened to a new world in which I could be myself, without unnecessary excuses and subordinations. But one day, when I was sitting in my small office, at my desk, immersed in creating a new design for the garden, my phone suddenly rang. It was one of those calls that you always wait for, but you're not always ready for them. I looked at the screen. Mom. There was a sweetness in her voice that seemed out of place, as if she was trying to hide something more than just kind words. Betty, dear, she said, and I felt her voice blurring in the air, filling me with an incomprehensible feeling. We've heard so much about your work. Your father and I are so proud of you. She said the words as if they didn't belong to her real voice. There was a certain tension in them, hidden, almost imperceptible. I raised an eyebrow, listening to her intonation. This change of tune on the line couldn't just be an accident. I couldn't understand what was behind her words. So many years have passed, and now she spoke to me as an equal, as a successful person who can be praised in public. But was it sincere? Did they finally understand me, or was it just another maneuver? Thank you, Mom, I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the worries that were beginning to build in my heart. I'm glad you're proud of me. She paused for a second, as if gathering her thoughts, and then continued, You know, we've always wanted the best for you, Betty. We thought you were. She didn't finish the sentence, but I felt some kind of heaviness hidden in her words. I tried to ignore it, but something inside me began to crack warily, like cracking wood under the weight of snow. You know, we're always waiting for you home, Betty. We are all very proud of your success, but you know how important it is to be there when you need to be. Her words sounded soft now, but there was still a hidden hint in them that their ideal family still wanted to get me back on track. To return to a place where I do not go beyond their borders, where I become a part of their world again. I could have just agreed, as always, but at that moment something in my inner world protested. I remembered their words, their ridicule, their cold attitude towards me when I was just starting my journey. I remembered how Mike had laughed at me, how they thought I had chosen the wrong path, a path that did not lead to success in their eyes. And now they were finally trying to get me back. I appreciate it, Mom, I replied, but there was not the gentleness in my voice that I had before. I couldn't just let myself go back. I can't be who they want me to be anymore. I've already become myself, and I'm not going to let their expectations determine who I am anymore. After my projects began to gain popularity, I felt like I was finally recognized, although not by everyone. My family, no matter how hard they tried, could not completely ignore my successes, and every day it became more difficult for me to ignore their views. I've always been someone who struggles with the shadow, with the expectations that define me, and with the imaginary framework they tried to fit me into. I was freed from these shackles, and it was inexpressibly sweet. However, this success, this light that I have been looking for so long, was not without a shadow. One day, in the middle of the working day, when I was standing on the outdoor terrace and drawing new sketches for a landscaping project for a large business center, my phone suddenly rang. I looked at the screen. Mom. Every year I learned to feel the sweetness in her calls, which always meant something important. A sweetness that suggested that we were not talking about simple news, but that there was something much more behind it. Betty, dear, we've heard so much about your work. Her voice was soft, full of what usually sounded like praise, but this time something in the intonation made me wary. Your father and I are so proud of you. Those words were both warm and strange, as if there was some hidden purpose in them, some subtext that I couldn't catch. I raised an eyebrow, trying to guess what was behind this change in her tone. This is a change of melody on the line, I thought, looking at the phone screen, feeling a sudden unease bind me. Mom always said such words to me with pride, but now something in her voice seemed too insinuating, as if she was trying to achieve something more than just an expression of parental pride. You know, she continued, not giving me time to answer, we'd like you to come home for a couple of weeks. You still haven't met Mike's friends. There will be a wonderful dinner in their honor. He is so looking forward to it. I felt the world around me slow down. Mike? His wedding was far behind him, and it would seem that everything went quietly, without unnecessary events. But I understood that his friends and their influence on me was something more than a simple family event. I remembered his words at the wedding, the grin he left when he told me that everything is clear with the bushes. He had never been a supporter of my path, and I understood that his perception of my success had always remained something absurd for him. But what was offered to me? The impossibility of not noticing your past? Or perhaps it was just another test of strength? After all, in my family, I always remained something on the edge, neither completely my own nor someone else's, but always an important part of their lives, which somehow had to be reckoned with. Betty, Mom's voice brought me back to reality. You won't be offended, will you? We're all so glad to see you. And, you know, your projects. We discussed this with your father and Mike. My gaze fell on the sketches left on the table, and suddenly I realized that there was more to this call. There was something too naked in her words, as if she wasn't just talking about being proud of my success. I fell silent, listening to myself and asking questions that I didn't want to look for answers to. I was no longer the Betty who stood in the shadows, and I realized that maybe I still needed to go home. But not for their sake, but for my own. And so, just as I was about to answer, and my hand was already reaching for the phone, the thought dawned on me, what exactly do they expect from me? This call was not just an invitation to dinner, not just an attempt to establish a relationship. It was more than that. And I felt that in this call, in these words, there is more than just pride. There were plans behind them that I didn't know about yet, and perhaps they had already begun to take shape much earlier than I realized. With every step I took, returning to this world, everything became more confusing, and I suddenly realized that not all the doors I opened were actually the ones I thought they were. And so, at the moment when I put the phone to my ear again, it seemed to me that I was on the verge of something much more than just a family return. On the threshold of something that could change everything,